It may be time to step outside the familiar narrative that treats Neanderthals as a completely separate species, and instead consider them as a regional branch of a broader human lineage, one that unfolded across an interconnected landscape rather than emerging from a single isolated point of origin. The biblical image of an African Garden of Eden, followed by clean dispersals and rigid separations, begins to look increasingly like an oversimplification when set against the archaeological and genetic evidence for repeated contact, overlap, and exchange stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. If we extend our perspective to around 500,000 years ago, what comes into focus is not a set of isolated populations evolving in parallel, but a web of related groups distributed from Africa into Europe and the Near East, diverging in form, yet remaining biologically and culturally connected. In this view, Neanderthals are not an evolutionary dead end standing apart from us, but one expression of a wider human continuum, shaped by regional environments, but still part of a shared lineage that was never fully divided. The story usually begins with a map, but maps can be deceptive things, especially when they're used to draw hard lines across landscapes that were never truly divided. Africa here, Eurasia there, arrows moving cleanly outward as if ancient populations behaved like ink on paper. But the archaeological record does not move in arrows. It accumulates layer by layer in river terraces, cave floors, and wind-blown sediments. And sometimes, if you look closely enough, those layers begin to whisper a different kind of story. One such whisper comes from a gravel formation in northern France, at a place called Cagny-la-Garenne, where stone tools lie embedded in sediments dated not to some recent expansion, but to roughly 450,000 years ago, deep within marine isotope stage 12, one of the coldest periods of the Middle Pleistocene. These are not crude implements. They are structured, deliberate, and above all, they belong to a technological system that feels familiar across continents, the Levallois method. At first glance, Levallois technology appears deceptively simple. A core is shaped in such a way that a single carefully prepared strike produces a flake of predetermined size and form. But that simplicity hides a cognitive leap, one that requires planning depth, spatial awareness, and a kind of mental template that exists before the tool is even made. It is not just a technique, it is a way of thinking about stone. And what makes it so unsettling to conventional narratives is not merely its sophistication, but its sudden, widespread appearance across vast regions of Africa, the Middle East and Europe, within a relatively narrow window of time, roughly between 500 and 300,000 years ago. The question that lingers, quietly but persistently, is whether this was a single invention that spread, or whether it emerged independently in multiple populations that were perhaps not as isolated from one another as we have been led to believe.
But the standard model we have right now is really almost hard to believe.
If you follow the evidence without forcing it into predefined categories, something begins to take shape. The Levallois method does not neatly belong to a single species. It is found in contexts associated with early Homo sapiens in Africa, with Neanderthals in Europe, and with populations in the Levant that seem to blur the boundaries between the two. It appears in river valleys, cave systems, and open-air sites that were connected not by political borders but by ecological corridors, coastlines, grasslands, and river networks that would have facilitated movement over thousands of years. In this sense, Levallois is less a cultural artifact of a single lineage and more a signal of interaction, a technological language spoken across a network of populations that were exchanging ideas, genes, and behaviors long before anyone thought to draw a line between modern and archaic. The dating evidence, while often treated as a constraint, actually opens this picture even further. The French sites, including Cagny-la-Garenne, push Levallois into Western Europe by around 450 to 400,000 years ago, firmly within a glacial context. In East Africa, sites like Cap Tourine have been proposed to show Levallois-like techniques at similar or slightly earlier dates, although the chronology there has been debated due to issues with stratigraphic integrity and radiometric uncertainty. What matters is not which site is earliest by a few tens of thousands of years, but the broader pattern. By roughly 500,000 years ago, populations across a continuous geographic zone stretching from North Africa through the Levant and into Europe were engaging in remarkably similar technological practices. That is not the signature of isolated invention. It is the signature of connectivity. The Kapthurin site in Kenya is often brought into this debate because it has been cited as one of the earliest possible examples of Levallois technology, sometimes pushed toward the 400,000-year range, which would make it extremely important for any argument about where this method began. But the problem is that Kapthurin is not a clean, simple, smoking gun site. The dating depends on complex volcanic, sedimentary, and stratigraphic relationships, and the key question is whether the tools truly belong securely within the dated beds, or whether older and younger materials may have been mixed, reworked, or assigned too confidently to a broad formation. Applying a reasonable interpretation of the site suggests that the tools were made 100,000 years ago, using 400,000-year-old stone, rather than the tools themselves being 400,000 years old. That does not mean Kapthurin should be dismissed, but it does mean it should not be treated as proof that Levallois began in East Africa and then spread outward. At best, it shows that prepared core technology was also present in East Africa very early. At worst, it shows how fragile these origin stories become when a whole continent-wide model is built on deposits where the dating and context are still open to debate. This is where the idea of a Levallois lineage begins to take on meaning, not as a literal genetic lineage in the traditional sense, but as a population network defined by shared behaviors and adaptive strategies. Imagine a series of overlapping populations occupying the Mediterranean basin and its surrounding regions, moving in response to climate shifts, expanding during warmer interglacials and contracting into refugia during colder periods. These populations would not have been static. They would have mixed, split, and recombined over time, carrying with them not only their genes, but their technological traditions. In such a system, a technique like Levallois does not need to be invented multiple times independently. It can emerge within a connected network and diffuse through repeated contact, imitation, and adaptation. The Mediterranean in this context is not a barrier, but a corridor. Its coastlines, dotted with caves and rich in marine resources, would have supported sustained human occupation. Its relatively stable climate, compared to the harsher conditions of northern Europe or the fluctuating environments of inland Africa, would have made it a kind of long-term refugium where populations could persist and interact over extended periods. When we find both early Homo sapiens and Neanderthal-associated remains concentrated in this region, it should not be surprising. What is more surprising is how often this concentration is overlooked in favor of models that emphasize separation rather than continuity. Neanderthals in particular complicate the picture. Traditionally viewed as a distinct lineage that evolved in Europe after an earlier dispersal out of Africa, they are often treated as the end point of a separate evolutionary trajectory. But their association with Levallois technology, especially in its more refined forms, suggests a deeper connection. If Levallois is present in Europe by around 450,000 years ago, and if Neanderthal ancestors were already established there, then either they independently developed this technique in parallel with populations in Africa, or they were part of a broader network through which such innovations spread. The latter scenario becomes increasingly plausible when we consider the genetic evidence for repeated gene flow between African and Eurasian populations throughout the Middle Pleistocene. The Levant sits at the center of this puzzle like a hinge. Sites in this region often contain a mixture of features that defy simple classification, with skeletal remains showing a blend of traits traditionally assigned to both Neanderthals and modern humans, and tool assemblages that incorporate Levallois methods alongside other techniques. This is not a transitional zone in the sense of a one-way migration corridor. It is a dynamic interface where populations met, interacted, and perhaps merged. In such an environment, the spread of a technology like Levallois would not require a single origin point followed by diffusion. It could arise within the network itself, shaped by the cumulative contributions of multiple groups. What makes this period between 500 and 300,000 years ago particularly significant is that Levallois does not appear in isolation. It coincides with other behavioral and technological shifts, including more complex use of fire, improved hafting techniques, and changes in site organization that suggest more complex social structures. These are not random developments. They point to a broader reorganization of human behavior, one that may reflect changes in population density, interaction rates, and ecological pressures. In other words, Levallois is part of a package, a suite of innovations that together define a new mode of adaptation. If we step back and consider the implications, the notion of a Levallois lineage begins to blur the boundaries between species in a way that is difficult to ignore. If both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens are using similar technologies, and if those technologies are embedded in a shared behavioral framework, then the distinction between them becomes less about absolute differences and more about regional variation within a connected system. This does not mean that they were identical, but it does suggest that they were not as isolated as traditional models imply. The genetic evidence, with its signals of interbreeding and shared ancestry, reinforces this view, indicating that the populations associated with these technologies were part of a complex web of relationships, rather than discrete, non-interacting units. The temptation, of course, is to locate a single origin for Levallois, to identify a point on the map where it first appeared and from which it spread. But this approach may be fundamentally misguided. Technologies do not exist in a vacuum. They emerge from the interactions of people, environments, and materials, and in a system where populations are connected, innovation can be both local and distributed. It is entirely possible that Levallois-like concepts were explored in multiple regions, refined through contact, and eventually converged into a recognizable method that spread across the network. In this sense, the origin of Levallois may not be a place, but a process. That process, if we follow it, leads us back to the Mediterranean world, not as a peripheral zone between continents, but as a central arena in which human evolution unfolded. Here, along the coasts and river valleys, populations that would later be labeled as Neanderthals and modern humans were already sharing landscapes, resources, and ideas. The Levallois method, with its emphasis on planning and precision, becomes a marker of that shared world, a technological thread that connects disparate sites into a coherent pattern.
So there's a standard dogma that's developed over an accretion of papers where the data, the history gets patched. So someone sequences a genome, someone performs an analysis, someone proves something that wasn't known before. And so we claim a mixture event. We didn't know about it before, an event that we didn't know before. And that gets patched onto the current model, which is now a series of patches.
Interesting.
And nobody has really rethought the whole thing very hard. So what's been put together is a complicated model and epicycles, ideas like natural selection, to kind of make it work. It's not impossible. It may be the case, but one wonders whether profoundly different models might actually explain the data. And so that's something that we and others have been thinking about. Can there be other models? An example of another model that might be able to explain the data that we've been playing with is one where there's much more DNA in Neanderthals from modern humans than the 3 or 5% that's been estimated. And we can get such models to fit, but here it's 30% or 50% or 70%. So,
Indeed, something does not quite fit with the conventional narrative that places the emergence of modern human behavior firmly within Africa and attributes its spread to a later expansion. If Levallois is already present across Africa, the Middle East and Europe by around 400,000 years ago, and if it is associated with populations that are not easily classified into modern categories, then the idea of a single, recent origin for such behaviors begins to look increasingly fragile. Instead, what we see is a deep time continuity, a network of populations evolving together, exchanging traits and technologies over hundreds of thousands of years. This does not resolve the question of where Levallois originated, but it reframes it in a way that may be more productive. Rather than asking where it began, we might ask how it became widespread, and what that tells us about the structure of human populations during the Middle Pleistocene. The answer, increasingly, points toward a model of interconnected populations spanning the Mediterranean and adjacent regions, with fluid boundaries and frequent interactions. In such a model, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are not separate branches that occasionally touch, but components of a broader system that shares a common technological and behavioral foundation. As the evidence continues to accumulate, the Levallois lineage, if we can call it that, emerges not as a lineage in the strict biological sense, but as a signature of connectivity, a reflection of a world in which human populations were far more integrated than our maps suggest. It is a reminder that the past does not conform to our categories, and that the lines we draw, whether between continents or species, often obscure more than they reveal. And if that is true, then the story of Levallois is not just about stone tools, but about the deeper question of what it means to belong to a lineage at all, in a world where boundaries were always shifting, and where the flow of ideas may have mattered just as much as the flow of genes. And with that statement, we leave you to ponder the mysteries of our shared human history. Until next time, stay curious and stay questioning. Also, please subscribe, share and explore our channel's other videos. Thank you and take care.